We're so happy to have Kevin Stiver back again tonight. He is a junior at Bellwood High School. And I'm sure that doing his research for his first book about the village of Glen White, Kevin was intrigued by the railroad in and around the Horseshoe Curve. His mind may have wondered why the rails were laid where they are. After the success of the first book, Kevin decided to continue to write about the history of the area. Tonight, we will discover just what Kevin discovered in his research. Thank you for joining us to listen to Kevin for his Trails to Rails Conquering the Alleghenies. Overcoming the Alleghenies.
Okay, before we get started, I want to thank everybody, each and every one of you, for coming out to support me tonight, to support local history. This is my second book. This is the premiere night for this project, so for you, those of you in attendance will be one of the first people to get one of these books. So again, thank you for getting that, and I'll have books for sale after this presentation. So without further ado, here we go. A little bit about myself. I am Kevin Stiver. I'm 16. I got my license 2 weeks ago. Pretty excited. I will be a 2026 Bellwood Annis graduate. I spent my summer on the weekends and giving tours at Baker Mansion. It's something I really enjoyed doing over the summer. And if you were here last August, I gave my presentation on Glen White, Pennsylvania, which has been a really good seller for me and throughout the area, and is in probably 25 of the 50 states. So I was recognized by the Blair County Genealogical Society last September for my work with that, for Young Preservationist of History. I got that award at the Lakemont Casino, and I was really fortunate enough to receive that from the Historical Society. So, without further ado, the reason I am here tonight is because my pap had a book on his bookshelf called Conquering the Alleghenies, and it was written in 1966 by Fred Long. Does anybody in attendance know who Fred Long was or got the privilege to meet Fred Long? Few people. So Fred, he was a very well-known historian. He was in charge, one of the main people to get the rebuilding of Fort Roberdeau back for this for the 200th anniversary of the United States. It was completed in '76. He wrote this book in 1966, and it covered systems of travel to get over the Allegheny Mountains here in Blair County. It really intrigued me because a lot of where he talked about was really close to where I grew up. And the Kittanning Trail, probably the least talked about topic that I'll talk about tonight, really intrigued me to think 300 years ago that Indians and just starting colonists were using just footpaths through the woods that they had given names to get across what was a young colony of Pennsylvania. So I wanted to expand on that and return this information back to the shelf. So I dedicated this book, Overcoming the Alleghenies, to Fred Long and this area's history. So it covers the same topics, but I go into a little bit more detail than Fred did. His is only about a 20-page little booklet. Mine's over about 140 pages. If you are interested in reading that book, it is on file over here at the Genealogical Society, right over there. So if you want to come out and check that out, feel free to do so. So the topic tonight, we'll start with the Kittanning Indian Trail. The Kittanning Indian Trail was probably the highway of the time, the 1700s. It was more commonly used by the Indians at first and has recorded use by our colonists in 1721. It ran from Kittanning, Pennsylvania to just beyond Harrisburg, and it passed through our area in a few locations that we are familiar with today. At first, this was the main way of travel through this area. It is the way that colonists communicated with the Indians. There were several missions, I guess you could call them, carried out, and the way to get to and from each location was the use of the Kittanning Indian Trail. So this is a map of the eastern corridor of the Frankstown Path, it is also called, because it's met along with various other Indian paths at Frankstown. Frankstown was named after Frank Stevens, who was a trade post operator, and he was set up shop about the same time in 1721, 1723, somewhere in there. Frankstown is set up on the old Lenape Indian village of Assunta-Pachula, which means where many waters meet, which is where the waters meet in that area. So from Frankstown, you can see there is a path going north, there's a path going south, there's a path going east, which is the path here, the Kittanning Trail. You can see it goes out towards Standing Stone, out towards down through Three Springs, and out towards, I believe that is, it's either Lewistown or Lewisburg. Mechanicsburg. My correction there. So the western half of that, it would be going back towards Kittanning. So from down here, Frankstown goes up through Altoona, up where the Horseshoe Curve, out towards Cherry Tree, Tress Springs, and out forth to Kittanning, which is up here. Kittanning was the site of a great Indian massacre in the 1760s. And here at home, there were several other Indian massacres that had taken place. Leading up to this, the Kittanning Indian Massacre in 1756, there was a man, Conrad Weiser. He was an Indian spokesperson. He was the communicator. He made the deals with the Indian and the colonists. And he used the Kittanning Trail to get from the eastern part of this colony to Kittanning to communicate with the Indians. So it was a trip of short-lived peace. And there was an Indian leader named Captain Jacobs. It was his English name. And he was in Kittanning. And the colonists set foot out to Kittanning. And they were not satisfied with the result of their battle until they had the scalp of Captain Jacobs hanging from their sides. So that took place in September of 1756. Here at home, I should mention some locations we're familiar with. So in this part of Blair County, Fort Fetter, that was one of 6 Revolutionary War forts that are in the boundaries of today's Blair County. So it starts from Fort Fetter up towards where the Meadows ice cream is there, further out towards where they call Young's Crossing, which is the closest thing to the Blair County Convention Center, out across the ridge of the cemetery at Altarest Park, down to Logan Valley Mall, which was a very frequent campground and where Three Springs came together, past the Sheets headquarters on 58th Street, up 58th Street into Lake Altoona, which is the first reservoir heading towards Horseshoe Curve, went past Horseshoe Curve, and went up towards Asheville. So there are several markers in this vicinity commemorating the Indian Trail. There's one at the Logan Valley Mall on Goods Lane. That used to be where the highway is now, but it was moved and in turn placed on Goods Lane. There is one on 764, which as it's pictured here, and it commemorates the one of the Indian massacres that took place. This was a Revolutionary War battle. It happened June 3rd, 1781. And the context of this is there were some Indians that have captured some Europeans. And there was a group of colonists who were out and about, and around present-day Alexandria, they found their camp, and with the size of the huts that were there, and the sign that the fires were still smoldering, they assumed that if they met the Indians, they would meet them at the base of Kittanning Point, which is where Horseshoe Curve is today. So they set out from Fort Fetter, where the Y Switches is, and they went to about the meeting of Sugar Mill and Burgoon Run near 58th Street. They realized that the Indians got a little ahead from what they thought, and they heard a large war cry from a British-led group of Indians, and the massacre took place in the vicinity of the former location of Bickle's auction house. So that is where that marker is located. There is a newer one with new information out towards Rudders on 764, and it gives you who was involved in the battle and the outcome of the battle to them. It tells you if they were prisoners, if they were wounded and killed as well. I have that information in the book as well. But these markers are located in the book, and these are basically the only things we have to celebrate the Kittanning Trail. Afterwards, after this massacre, the trail saw less use. The end of the Revolutionary War soon followed, and since it was a permanent site for their colony of Pennsylvania, they decided to improve roads further from there. So they went on to charter the Huntington-Cambrian Indiana Turnpike system, which in the early 1800s, it was a thought to connect the state from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia by road. It would take you probably 2 weeks to get that distance on the roads and rough trails that they had already, but they wanted to build a turnpike so the colony could get some money and get things moving. So the Huntington-Cambrian Indiana Turnpike was a small little piece of that, and it was completed in about the 1820s, 1824, underneath the management of President John Blair, who is the namesake of our county. So John Blair, he lived in what is now Blair's Gap, where the Mule Chute Culvert is, and Old Route 22 goes up over. Old Route 22 is where this road went up over. And they thought it was going to be the best thing to get this completed. But when completed, it saw very, very light use. They decided to charge by the mile of how far you went. So it was 7 cents a mile for you to take your carriage, however far distance you wanted to. And it was not as well as a moneymaker for what they thought. But it was well built, and it was a pretty big accomplishment for this time to have a turnpike established in Blair County, because when the state was drawing up these plans, Huntington was eliminated from that. And the people in Huntington gathered together and they campaigned to get the turnpike moved up here to the Allegheny Mountains so that they could be connected with the state easier. So that's what happened there. So they used that for about 10 years until they decided we need a faster mode of transportation to connect our state. And that is when, in 1831, the Allegheny Portage Railroad was chartered on March 22nd, or 26th. And by canal, you could go from around Philadelphia to Hollidaysburg by canal, and Johnstown, and further on into Pittsburgh, you could go by canal. But the things in between Huntington and Johnstown were these steep Allegheny Mountains that didn't have any creeks or streams going around. So they decided to build a series of inclined planes right up beside the road, in which the Route 22, old Route 22 as known today, goes up. So this is a time period picture from about the early 1900s, but the inclines would have been phased out by then. But this is the Fountain Inn. It was a popular stay for turnpike goers, and it is just located about where the highway splits today, with the reservoir in the middle and just off to the right there going up. There's a lone grave of the Alleghenies there. With the story with that is there was a person staying there at the inn, and they went down to fish down the stream, and they in turn looked up in the woods and saw a man hanging there in the woods by himself in 1905, and they realized that he had been hanging there for a good month. and nobody knew who he was. So that he was just buried where they found him. And that was the case for actually that massacre that happened in 1781. They just buried where they laid. So that is an example of that there as well. So the Allegheny Portage Railroad. This story of the inclined planes is the old Allegheny Portage Railroad. It was only in use for about 20 years. It was completed in 1834. And at first it was a very complicated system. It didn't go as planned. They were already off to a rough start. It was going to be a two-way system, but it opened as a one-way system with the rail for the second rail line over on a boat over in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, waiting to arrive at the ports. So there was only one-way travel basically, and you had travel meet, and there was just chaos, and chaos would erupt with fist fights and who knows what else. So it all around wasn't a very good system. So for a couple years it was in use, and it again was very, very slow to go from a canal boat, to get out of your canal boat, to get onto a passenger car, go up over the inclined planes, get down back into a boat, and go across and to your location. But this was the series of inclined planes approximately. So you had your basin at Johnstown, basin at Hollidaysburg. Up here's the Allegheny front where the ridge is. And the inclines varied in length, varied in height. And the foot of 10 is named after the foot of plane 10, which started just outside of Hollidaysburg there. Why they numbered them in the order they did, I'm not sure, but 10 starts there, go up to 5 and 6, and back down to 1 in Johnstown. So this was a depiction of what inclined plane number 10 would have looked like. So there was an engine house at the top of each inclined plane, and it pulled the boats up the mountain. And it created a lot of work for a lot of people. It was still a very in-use system, so it called for a lot of people to operate it. And with the seasons here in the Allegheny Mountains, there's always work to be done when seasons change. The locks that were built in the canal system would often fall apart through the winter months with the frost, so there had to be people that had to rebuild those. And this was also a scene of tragedy. It was all new to them, this system of rail over the mountains, and there were often times where the hemp rope pulling these very, very heavy boats up the mountain would often break, and they would go down the mountain, back down to the base, and it would injure or kill a few. With all that, it was thought of to replace it. So these engine houses weren't doing very good. They were slow, like I mentioned. So it was decided to move away from a system like this. That's the Lemon House up there on plane number 6. To move away from horses being used in tunnels to the steam engines in the later use of that. And just the transportation in between cars was just getting too much for the travelers. So the Allegheny Portage Railroad got a facelift. The new Allegheny Portage Railroad. This idea was considered just a few years after the original system had opened. But it wasn't chartered until the 1850s, early 1850s. And it did not complete fully when it opened. It was completed in March 1855. The new Allegheny Portage Railroad was the use of the mule shoe curve, which the culvert is still there on the original Huntington Turnpike, as I mentioned. But it followed the route of the inclined planes, and without using the inclined planes, they built a thing similar to Horseshoe Curve to avoid all that. And that, just like everything else we talked about, wasn't as good as they thought. They They were actually in debt several thousands of dollars because just a year before, a privately chartered organization was opened up something new. And in 1854, that was the world famous Horseshoe Curve, which we're familiar with. Before that, the Pennsylvania Railroad was using its own system incorporated into the Muleshoe Curve. So they had the Y switches. The Y switches is because of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad main line is the El Dorado branch, is what it is called now. Runs through El Dorado and out towards South Altoona. And the Y switches, it would connect to the new Portage Railroad, go around Muleshoe, and up towards Glitzen to the new Portage Tunnel, near where our Glitzen tunnels are today. But the Muleshoe Curve there, it opened up, and this is one of the first pictures, or really illustrations of it, and you can see there are two culverts there instead of the one. So right now it is the second culvert that has been built there, but that is the two. It has been downgraded to one. I can speak, but it was originally two, and you can see there is still a little bit use on the Huntington Cambrian Indiana Turnpike down below. And here's a newer picture of the Portage Railroad's Muleshoe line. I'd like to think in this picture travel was so light that their passenger cars only had one car. Passenger trains only had one car. So just a single line at this point going around. And that's where we come to the Pennsylvania Railroad. With the opening of the Horseshoe Curve, they didn't need to use the Muleshoe Curve anymore. And the Pennsylvania Railroad was basically the heartbeat of the final years of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So it basically drove them out of business until Pennsylvania Railroad acquired what the railroad had, the Portage Railroad had in 1857. They operated the Muleshoe line for just a couple months, and just like everybody else, it didn't work out too good for them, so they decided to rip up the rail, and they didn't put rail back down on it until 1901, when travel by train was pretty popular, and it stayed there for 80 years until Conrail removed it in 81. But the Horseshoe Curve, that was the heartbeat of this whole the next thing that came out. It bypassed the inclined plains. It took very, very long to get across our state. The canal system was still in use until about the 1870s with the iron furnaces. If you were here last month for the iron furnaces, the canal was used to help them. And the Portage Railroad was still a good thing for this area, despite having its issues early on, but it kept up with the times as much as it could. But it would become replaced with the Horseshoe Curve, opening February 15, 1854. And this is one of the only pictures that I could actually find of construction of the Horseshoe Curve. This was on file at the Railroaders Memorial Museum. The curve was largely built by the Irish immigrants of the area, largely coming over to the area because of the potato famine over in Ireland. So they came here, easy work, excuse me. And just like the canal system, immigrants in turn built the Horseshoe Curve. Little civilizations stuck around there. So this is in today's first reservoir, Lake Altoona, and this is the house of George and Mary Miller. They lived there until they sold their property to the Altoona Water Authority, the city of Altoona, when they constructed the first reservoir in 1908 in the early 19-teens. And the road originally went down through here, and where you turn to go back to where that bridge is and circle back around. The road actually came down off the bank, down through where the reservoir was, and back up and connected where this picture was taken. And that loosely followed the route of the Kittanning Trail, which is where we're going to be starting at. So the Kittanning Trail, in the 1700s, it went up past Kittanning Point, and now in 1854, there was the Horseshoe Curve further up. So we're moving further up towards the curve now. In the 19-teens, as I mentioned, rail travel was pretty popular, and businesses knew that. So they had displays along the rail put up. So this is a 57 up on the bank above the railroad. Does anybody think they could figure out what that 57 was representing? Heinz ketchup. So that, coming down around the Horseshoe Curve, and you look out your left window, and you see this large 57 there. I found a newspaper article that said the 57 will soon be removed because it blocks the scenery of the Horseshoe Curve. It distracts you too much. So that wasn't long that was there. But there were some billboards there as well. We have Lip Society chocolates. There's a pocket watch here. This is the back of another billboard, and down here we have a Coca-Cola sign that is double-sided for the road and the railroad. So this is a very rare picture that I found from a friend recently. But we're here at Kittanning Point, and Kittanning Point was named by the Indians, so the people of the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to keep that name with Kittanning Point Station. That was there at the Horseshoe Curve from the 1860s until 1940 when it was torn down, sadly. It was also a tower, so the many rail towers that we have on the railroad, this was Tower KN for Kittanning, and the tower portion is up here in this little part, and it would act as a signal tower as seen here. So this is also another early picture of the Horseshoe Curve. Notice there's only 2 rails going around the Horseshoe Curve, and this is in the early days of the visitor center. So when the Horseshoe Curve was completed, there was a mound of dirt. If you've ever been to the Horseshoe Curve area today, it's a recreational area. You're basically in a little man-made valley with the dirt that has been removed, and it's mounted up on that side towards the road and the reservoirs. So that was there at the Horseshoe Curve, but it was flattened all out to create a little landing for people who wanted to go up and see the trains. So the first thing they put on display there is they said, you know what, let's be so kind and celebrate the people who we replaced. So they put a little canal boat on display up there at the visitor center. That's that there. Long before the K4 arrived. So I'm sure many of our older generation here can remember the Horseshoe Curve original gift shop operated by the Lockharts, and when there wasn't any admission fee. So this was, one building went down and another came up. This one was built in 1940 by the WPA, and it was completed when just about the same time the Kittanning Point Station was no longer there. So this is probably the most iconic picture of our Horseshoe Curve. This was taken in 1954 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Horseshoe Curve. This was a picture taken in October of the lights that lit up the curve with the help of Sylvania and using pie pans, several thousand pie pans. And the photographer for this picture had a very important job because he only had 3 seconds to capture this picture. All at once, the lights lit up, the fireworks went off, boom, and the lights went out and everybody went home. So this is that celebration. So,
what day was that?
That was, I'm not sure of the exact day, but I know it was in October of 1954. So, our rails developed some, they kept up with the times as well. So the horseshoe curve went up to 4 tracks eventually, with the 4th being installed in about 1901. Then we had the transfer from the Pennsylvania Railroad to Penn Central. It was the shortest lived rail company of the 4 we had operate these rails. We had a Pennsylvania engine out front and a Penn Central in the back. And switching rail companies from Conrail to now Norfolk Southern, the visitor center got a upgrade as well with the funicular and the new steps and the gift shop and the largely smaller parking lot. I read an article that before a fence was put up near the guard fence, the horseshoe curve parking lot that was there could accommodate 500 cars. And that is not the case with the parking lot that is there today. The route of the road was changed. So the road originally went back here past this culvert at Baker's Hollow and back out, and the road basically went through where the building sits, hugged the bank, and went up the road into Glen White. That it does. So this is an aerial view of Horseshoe Curve. Our rails wrap around, and just over this ridge here would have been dropping Kittanning Trail, and up and further into the ravine it went. So that is Overcoming the Alleghenies, the basis of it. So I cover a little bit more than Fred Long did. I tell you a little bit more about our Indians that were in this area, some Indian stories, some Indian massacre stories of the Holiday family that was here, the Dean family that lived near Fort Lowry, near Canoe Creek, their massacre, how we got to use the Huntington, Cambrian, Indiana Turnpike system, how the Allegheny Portage Railroad, even though it operated for 20 years, wasn't the best thing, and it was basically a competition between company and state, between the Pennsylvania Railroad and the state-owned main line of public works, which was the Allegheny Portage Railroad. So Overcoming the Alleghenies basically wraps all that up. It goes into a lot of detail in Horseshoe Curve, some facts that you might not have known, that the reservoir at Blair Gap, just beyond where the highway splits, that reservoir, believe it or not, there was 2 water tanks at Horseshoe Curve. And they were filled with water from that reservoir, 7 miles away. Why they didn't build a reservoir closer, I'm not sure. But it was piped out. From there, it came to a smaller reservoir in between Sugar Run and Horseshoe Curve Road. And from there, it went underneath the road and railroad up to those water tanks. The smaller one is no longer there, but the larger one is. And it's sitting there rusting away. But if you have any questions about some more in detail context of any of these topics, I will be over here with my new book and the Glen White book from last year. Books are $20. We do take cash check if anything doesn't work for you. But if you know anybody that wants to learn about these topics a little bit more, my next Glen White event will be October 8th at Crescent Public Library at 5 o'clock. And my next Alleghenies book presentation will be October 24th at 6 o'clock at Williamsburg Public Library. So again, thank you for coming out tonight. If you have any questions, stop by and talk to me over there. And thank you for supporting local history.